In this video, we will look at the executions carried out in the United States during the month of October. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On October 10th, 2025, after more than 23 years on death row, Roy Lee Ward was executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison. But what did he do to end up there? On the morning of July 11, 2001, in the small town of Dale, Indiana, 15-year-old Stacy Lynn Payne was at home, getting ready to leave for her summer job. Her 14-year-old sister Melissa was napping upstairs, and their parents had already left for work. It was supposed to be a normal day, but it wasn't. Because that morning, 24-year-old Roy Lee Ward walked up to the Payne home pretending to look for his missing dog. He begged Stacy to help him and convinced her to let him inside. But the moment the door closed behind him, something changed, and Stacy realized too late that she had made a terrible mistake. Upstairs, Melissa was jolted awake by the sound of her sister's screams. She rushed to the top of the stairs and saw a man pinning Stacy to the ground. Terrified, Melissa fled to her parents' room and dialed 911. As she spoke to the operator, she could hear her sister's voice. Stacy was crying, begging him to stop. And then came Roy's voice, cold and flat. "You better be quiet." The town marshal got there fast, and he found Roy in the doorway, soaked in sweat and holding a pocket knife in hand. The marshal pulled his weapon and shouted for him to get down, and Roy immediately dropped without a fight and said, "I didn't do anything." But the truth was just a few steps away. Inside, Stacy lay on the kitchen floor, nude from the waist down and soaked in blood. Her body was still, barely alive, but she couldn't speak. When the marshal asked questions, she could only nod. An ambulance rushed her to the hospital, but the damage was almost beyond what doctors could process. Her throat had been cut so deep it exposed her windpipe, her wrist was slashed clean to the bone, and the stab wounds in her vaginal area pointed to something even darker. Later, testing would confirm it. Her DNA was found on Roy's genitals. The local hospital wasn't equipped to handle such injuries, so they airlifted her by helicopter to the University of Louisville Hospital, clinging to life. She made it there alive, but not for long. Just 5 hours after Roy forced his way into her home, Stacy passed away. The autopsy would later confirm the horror. Her body showed 18 separate blunt force injuries, each one telling part of the story. 5 days later, on July 16th, prosecutors formally charged Roy with murder and announced they would seek the death penalty, pointing to 4 aggravating factors. He had intentionally killed Stacy while raping her. The murder happened while committing another sexual assault. He was already on probation for a felony burglary when he carried out the murder. And lastly, prosecutors argued that Stacy had been mutilated and tortured while she was still alive. They added and deviant conduct charges as well, sealing the case as one of the most disturbing the county had ever seen. In a town as small as Dale, with a population of just over 20,000 at the time, violence like this didn't happen. So when Stacy was killed, the story spread fast. Newspapers ran headline after headline, and local news stations covered every detail. It was almost impossible to live in Spencer County and not hear about it. A candlelight vigil for Stacy drew nearly 1,200 people, and more than 500 people filled the church for her funeral. But the sadness wasn't the only thing people carried. The rage was just as strong. When Roy appeared in court, a crowd filled the rotunda, yelling at him until the judge had to order them to calm down. With emotions running so high, Roy's lawyers tried to move the trial out of Spencer County. They argued that too many people already believed he was guilty, and that the media coverage, over 20 newspaper stories and more than a dozen television reports, made a fair trial impossible. Some articles even mentioned Roy's criminal record, something a jury would never be allowed to hear. The court did consider the request, but ultimately decided the case would stay in the very county where the crime had shaken so many lives. That decision made jury selection nearly impossible. By October 2002, when the process began, more than 80% of potential jurors admitted they had already heard about the case. Some had even formed strong opinions before ever setting foot in the courtroom. One wrote, "Unless you live under a rock, you've heard a lot about this case." And another went further, saying, "Hang him instantly. He should have been shot on the spot." After 2 long days of questioning, the court finally seated 12 jurors and 2 alternates. But even then, most had already heard the details, and several openly admitted they had made up their minds before the trial even started. The trial opened on October 14, 2002, and it didn't last long. In just 4 days, the jury heard everything. Roy's attorneys didn't try to deny what happened inside the Payne home. In fact, they told the jury outright, he is responsible for Stacey Payne's death. But they argued he hadn't meant to kill her, that the murder wasn't premeditated, just a tragic outcome of a violent moment. It was a thin defense, and the jury didn't buy it. They returned a guilty verdict on every count. A week later, on October 21st, the penalty phase began. This time, the jury heard more about Roy's past, about his violent outbursts, about the other crimes he had committed long before Stacey. And whatever doubt might have lingered disappeared. The jury voted for death. And the judge agreed, handing Roy Lee Ward a death sentence, plus 2 more 50-year terms for and deviate conduct. But that verdict didn't stick. In 2007, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the conviction. They ruled that the trial should have never been held in that county, where everyone knew the case and where outrage ran too deep. The court said Roy couldn't get a fair trial there. So they did it all over again. During the retrial, Roy stood up in court and admitted everything. He pleaded guilty to Stacey's murder and to deviate conduct. The same pain that had shaken Dale returned to the courtroom, and the jury delivered the same answer. They voted for death. And in 2007, a second judge gave Roy the same sentence all over again. From there, Roy began the slow march of death row. He spent 23 years filing one appeal after another, hoping for a way out, but every effort failed. And by 2025, the Indiana Supreme Court had enough. They denied his final appeal, which challenged the state's lethal injection method, and officially scheduled his execution for October 10th. As the date closed in, Roy made a decision that surprised people. He chose not to appear before the Indiana Parole Board. Not because he had given up, but because he didn't want Stacey Payne's family to feel obligated to travel all the way to the prison in Michigan City to watch him beg for mercy. According to his attorney, Joanna Green, that choice wasn't about arrogance or guilt. It was about Roy's autism. She explained that he struggled to communicate emotion in a way people could understand, and trying to explain remorse face to face would have done more harm than good. The parole board had a clear job, but a heavy one. They had to hear both sides, what the lawyers argued, what the Payne family had been through, and then make a recommendation. But even then, their decision wasn't final. Only the governor could stop the execution. He could choose to delay it, reduce the sentence to life, or let it move forward. On September 22, 2025, the parole board gave their answer, move forward, and 2 days later, the governor agreed. Roy's time had finally run out. On October 10, 2025, Roy's final day came. He was given the chance to choose his last meal, and he didn't hold back. From Texas Corral, he asked for a hamburger, a steak melt, an order of fries, a baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, a sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and a side of breadsticks. Around midnight, he was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked for any final words, Roy simply said, "Brian is going to read them." After that, the process moved forward without complications. By 12:33 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Roy Lee Ward was 47 years old. Just 4 days later, the next execution took place. On October 14, 2025, after 36 years on death row, former church deacon Samuel Lee Smithers was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? It all started with a simple arrangement. In 1995, Sam agreed to mow the grass at a vacant house owned by Marion Whitehurst, an elementary school teacher who also attended the church where Sam worked at the time. The property sat on 27 fenced acres of land, surrounded by woods and dotted with shallow ponds. Marion gave Sam a key to the gate, but not the house. He kept mowing through the next year, and by May 1996, the routine hadn't changed. Sam handled the lawn, and Marion stayed away. But that changed on May 28th, when Marion stopped by unexpectedly. She unlocked the gate and drove up the long driveway, expecting a quiet visit, but instead, she saw Sam's truck parked beside the carport. He was outside, wiping down an axe. He claimed he had been trimming branches, but it wasn't the axe that caught her eye. It was a dark pool of blood in the carport. Sam quickly brushed it off, saying it was probably from a small animal, and he promised to clean it up. Marion left, but as she drove off, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept thinking about the drag marks she had seen running through the grass leading downhill toward one of the ponds. So that night, she called the sheriff's office. By the time deputies arrived, the blood had already been washed away, but those drag marks were still there, cutting a clear path through the grass. One deputy followed the trail and shined his flashlight over the surface of the pond. And that's when he saw her. A woman's body, floating near the edge. A dive team was called in, and soon a second body surfaced. The first was identified as Christy Cowan, and the second was Denise Roach. Both women were known in the area, and both worked as prostitutes. And from there, the evidence started piling up fast. Blood found in the carport matched Christy. A fingerprint inside the house matched Sam, and the muddy shoe prints left near the pond matched a pair they found in his bedroom. Even the surveillance footage nailed down the timeline. Just 2 days earlier, a convenience store security camera had caught him with Christy, walking in together and leaving together too. Everything led back to Sam, and this time there was no cleaning it up. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he tried to play it cool. He cooperated, even asked for his wife to sit in on the interview. But once the polygraph came back bad, the cracks started showing. First, he claimed he just happened to find Christy stranded on the side of the road with car trouble. He pulled over to help, took her to a nearby convenience store, and said things went south when she threatened to accuse him of rape if he didn't hand over some money. According to him, he drove her out to the Whitehurst property and gave her everything he had, but she wanted more. He said she threw a drink at him, and that's when he snapped. He grabbed an axe and hit her, then dragged her to the pond. He admitted that she was still alive. He could hear her struggling, making sounds, right up until Marion came by. But once Marion left, he hit Christy again to shut her up, then dumped her body in the water like she was nothing. As for Denise, he told detectives it began with an argument. When he first saw her on the property, she claimed she had permission to be there. But when she was still there the next day, things escalated. He said he told her to leave, but according to him, she refused, then hit him on the arm and threw a planter at his truck. In response, he pushed her against the wall. That's when a piece of wood, loose from the roof, fell and struck her head. She immediately fell to the ground, unconscious. But instead of calling anyone or trying to help her, Sam just walked away and left her there. When he returned to the property the next day, she was still laying on the ground. He then dragged her body to the pond and cleaned up the blood. But those stories unraveled fast. The medical examiner revealed what really happened, and it was far worse than what he claimed. Christy hadn't just been hit. She had been strangled. Her skull had been shattered by several axe blows, and her brain was pierced. There was foam around her mouth, suggesting she might have drowned while still alive. She also had injuries to her eye and lip, blunt force trauma to her jaw, and chop wounds to the top of her head and behind her ear. Denise had been in the water for more than a week, but even then, the damage was impossible to miss. Her skull was fractured, her face crushed, and there were 16 separate puncture wounds to her head. And just like Christy, she also showed clear signs of strangulation. The similarities were too many to ignore. Both women had worked the same part of town, what locals called the stroll, just off the cracked sidewalk outside the luxury motel. And both had been beaten, stabbed, and choked before being dumped in the same stretch of water. At trial, another worker named Bonnie Cruz took the stand. She testified that she had once dated Sam at the luxury motel, where he went by the name Rex. She said Sam had even offered her extra money, $280, to go with him to Seffner, but something about it felt off, so she said no. Another woman remembered giving Christy a condom on the same day she disappeared. That exact brand, the same color and the same wrapper, was later found inside the Whitehurst property. The details kept adding up. But when Sam finally testified, the story changed again. He told the jury that the confession he gave to detectives was a lie. He hadn't killed anyone, he claimed. He had only said he did because he was scared, not for himself, but for his family. According to this new version, everything started at his church. A young woman named Mimi had been serving community service there as part of her probation, and Sam was the one supervising her. He claimed she offered him sex in exchange for altering her records, to which he agreed. But weeks later, a man he called Mr. X showed up. This man, he said, knew about the deal with Mimi and threatened to expose it unless Sam let him use the Whitehurst property for drug deals. Sam testified that he felt like he had no choice. The man had leverage, and he gave in because he didn't see a way out. But his story didn't stop there. Sam told the jury that this mysterious figure wasn't just a blackmailer. He was the one responsible for the deaths of Christy and Denise. He said he watched helplessly as Mr. X murdered Denise and Christy. According to Sam, he hit Denise with a hatchet, then ordered him to drag her body to the pond. He claimed Christy was killed the same night and that he was forced to help clean up afterward. But to the jury, it all sounded like a story stitched together in panic, a desperate attempt to escape prison. And the evidence didn't back him up. Time cards showed that Sam left work at 5:23 p.m. on the day Christy was killed. By 6:19 p.m., a convenience store camera caught him with her. Detective Iverson even retraced the route himself from Sam's job to the motel, then the store, and finally the Whitehurst property, and everything lined up. The jury didn't buy the story of Mr. X because the timeline didn't lie. The defense tried to show the jury a different version of Sam. Family members testified that Sam had grown up in an abusive home. He had been beaten with belts by a mother who claimed she was beating the devil out of him. Others painted him as a loyal husband, a caring father, and later a model inmate behind bars. Mental health experts added that he had suffered multiple head injuries throughout his life, one as a baby, another during a robbery where he was hit with a shotgun butt. They claimed brain scans showed signs of damage and that he was living with chronic mental illness, unable to fully control or understand his actions. But the state pushed back hard. Their own experts dismissed everything, denying the presence of brain damage or mental illness. They told the jury Sam was not psychotic, that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that nothing about his background excused what he had done. And what unfolded in court was the story of two different men. At Boral Electric in Tampa, Sam was quiet, soft-spoken, and devout. He went to church, kept to himself, and never raised his voice. Co-workers called him a country bumpkin, harmless, respectful, and the kind of guy who always said, "Sir." He lived in a 2-story house just outside Plant City with his wife and their teenage son. Sam had once been a deacon and custodian at his local church, even trusted with the keys. But that trust shattered a year before the murders when he resigned in disgrace. A woman accused him of offering to falsify her community service hours for sex. The church cut ties, but the fallout didn't seem to reach his neighborhood. He still mowed his lawn, nodded politely, and waved to neighbors like nothing had changed. But on East Hillsborough Avenue, Sam was someone else. He wasn't the soft-spoken churchman. He was a regular to the women who worked the corners there. And what started as routine visits had escalated into something darker. And when it came time to decide his fate, the jury didn't hesitate. With 12 votes to 0, they recommended death. At the final hearing, Christie's father, John Cowan, stood up and asked the court to show mercy, not just for himself, but for Sam. He pleaded with the court to choose life without parole instead. Sam's ex-wife asked for the same, but the judge followed the jury's recommendation. And on June 25, 1999, Samuel Lee Smithers was sentenced to die for the murders of Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. He would spend the next 36 years on death row. Then, on October 14, 2025, time finally caught up. Samuel woke up at 6:30 a.m. and officials later said he was compliant. He didn't ask for a spiritual advisor and had no visitors. But he did request one special final meal: fried chicken, fried fish, apple pie, and a scoop of ice cream. Comfort food for a man who had spent more than 2 decades counting down the days. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Sam was already strapped to the gurney with an IV line in his arm. When asked if he had any final words, Sam simply said, "No, sir." No apology, no explanation, nothing. The warden gave the signal and the drugs began to flow. At first, his chest rose and fell heavily, and his body tensed with brief convulsions. But within moments, all movement stopped. A warden stepped forward, shook him, and called out his name. But Sam didn't respond. His skin gradually turned gray as the minutes ticked by. And at 6:14 p.m., a medic entered the chamber to check for signs of life. 1 minute later, Sam was officially pronounced dead. The Department of Corrections later confirmed the execution had been carried out without complications. Samuel Lee Smithers was 72 years old. At that very same moment, in a different part of the country, another execution took place. After 16 years on death row, Lance Colin Shockley was executed by lethal injection at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. But what did he do? On the night of November 26, 2004, 27-year-old Lance Shockley climbed into a truck with his sister-in-law's fiancé, Jeffrey Bayless. The two men set off along the winding back roads near Van Buren, Missouri. But on the way back, something went terribly wrong. Lance lost control of the wheel and the truck shot off the road, slamming into a ditch. Shaken and bleeding, Lance pulled himself from the wreckage and made his way on foot to the nearby home of Ivy and Paul Napier. He told them there had been an accident and that he needed help. Ivy noticed his hands were covered in blood and pulled him inside to look after his injuries. Then Paul followed Lance back to the crash site. Jeffrey was still inside the truck, severely injured. Paul saw right away that there was nothing they could do to save him. So they turned around and went back to the house, where Lance called his wife and 911. Not long after, Lance left the scene with his wife Corey and her sister Cindy Chilton, who was also Jeffrey's fiancée. On the way, Lance turned to Cindy and said the words she never expected to hear. Jeffrey was gone. The women dropped Lance off at home, then rushed back to the crash site. And when they returned, Ivy and Paul were still there. Moments later, police and highway patrol officers arrived. They found Jeffrey's body in the passenger seat, and inside the cab were crushed beer cans and an open bottle of tequila. But outside, smeared across the wheel well, was something far more troubling: a streak of blood. And one question remained: who had been driving? Sergeant Carl Graham of the Missouri Highway Patrol was assigned to the case, and that same night, he knocked on Lance's door. But Lance's story had changed. Now he claimed he had never said he was driving, and worse, that he hadn't even been in the truck at all. Ivy Napier knew that wasn't true. She knew for sure Lance confessed to her that he had wrecked the truck. But when Sergeant Graham asked her about it, she said nothing. And for a while, that seemed to be the end of the story. But 4 months later, Carl Graham still hadn't given up, and he started to press harder. He tracked Ivy down at work and told her, falsely, that Lance had already confessed, and that pushed her to finally talk. Ivy told him that Lance had shown up at her house right after the wreck, shaken, desperate, and very much aware of what he had done. Inside, he admitted he had been driving. Lance quickly found out Ivy had talked, and now Carl knew everything. It was clear the sergeant wasn't going to let it go, and when Cindy's mother mentioned that he wanted a meeting, Lance saw what was coming. He had to do something. So he asked Cindy's stepfather for the sergeant's home address. But nobody knew what consequences that would have. The next day, March 20th, 2005, Lance borrowed his grandmother's red Pontiac Grand M. The car, an old 1995 model, stood out, especially with a big yellow sticker on the trunk. And witnesses would later recall they saw that same car parked on the wrong side of the road near Sergeant Carl Graham's house. The car sat there for nearly 3 hours, from 1:45 until after 4 p.m. that afternoon. At 4:03 p.m., Carl had finished his patrol shift, backed his cruiser into the driveway, and stepped out. And that's when the ambush began. A rifle round ripped through his Kevlar vest and smashed his spine at the neck. He dropped instantly, crashing to the pavement with such force that his skull and ribs fractured. But he was still alive when the attacker moved in, and then 2 more blasts rang out, this time from a shotgun, one tearing into his face, another into his shoulder. And by the time someone finally found him at 5:15 p.m., the 12-year veteran of the Missouri Highway Patrol was already gone. That night, suspicion closed in fast. Around 7 p.m., Lance's wife handed a box of .243 caliber bullets to his uncle, saying, "Lance said you'd know what to do with them." But it was already too late. Investigators had already begun to focus on Lance, and 2 state troopers, backed by a SWAT team hidden in the woods, came to his house. They phoned him first, saying they needed to talk about the murder, but he brushed them off and told them to find him at work. And when he finally stepped outside, he denied any involvement and claimed he had been with his neighbor all day, working around the house. Then, with the calm of someone daring them to act, he ordered the officers off his property and warned them not to return without a warrant. "If you do," he threatened them, "there's going to be trouble and somebody's going to be shot." The next morning, Lance stuck to his story. He told investigators the same alibi he had given before. But during a phone call to his wife during lunch, officers overheard something that changed everything. She reminded him she had already told police he was home until almost 5:45 p.m., hours after Sergeant Carl Graham had been killed. And Lance didn't correct her. Instead, he calmly said, "Okay, that will work. That will be fine." But by then, things were starting to fall apart. Lance tried to get his grandmother to lie for him, asking her to say he had been home all day. And when she hesitated, he pressed a finger over her mouth and repeated, "I was home all day." And he didn't stop there. He also warned his cousin not to repeat what he had overheard, trying to seal the cracks before they split wide open. But it didn't work. On March 23, 2005, police arrested Lance Shockley. First for fleeing the scene of the crash that killed Jeffrey Bayless, and then for the murder of Sergeant Carl Graham. But the case dragged on. His trial didn't begin until 2009, 4 years after the murder. Because of all the media attention, the venue was moved out of Carter County and into Howell County. There, a jury was finally seated. Prosecutors said Lance killed Carl to stop the investigation into the earlier accident. But the defense called that theory ridiculous, arguing that killing one officer wouldn't make a case disappear. They claimed Lance was innocent. Still, investigators stood firm. They believed Lance had one goal: silence the man who was getting too close. On March 27, 2009, the jury came back after just 3 hours of deliberation. They found Lance guilty of first-degree murder. But the trial wasn't over. What came next was the penalty phase, the part where the jury would decide whether Lance should be sentenced to life or death. The law required the jury to weigh any mitigating evidence against the aggravating factors, Prosecutors laid out 4. First, that Carl was a peace officer, and Lance killed him because of his job. Second, the murder was vile and inhuman, evidence, they said, of what they called a depraved mind. Third, the murder was committed to avoid a lawful arrest. And finally, that Carl was a potential witness in the crash investigation, and Lance killed him to silence him. The jurors agreed on 3 of the 4. They found that Carl was targeted because he was an officer, because he could testify against Lance, and because Lance wanted to stop the arrest that was coming. But what they could not agree on was the punishment. Some wanted life without parole, while others wanted death. And in the end, they deadlocked. Under Missouri law, when a jury can't reach a decision on punishment, the responsibility falls to the judge. And Judge David Evans did not hesitate. He reviewed the same evidence, the same aggravators, and ruled that the weight of the case demanded death. On May 22, 2009, Lance was formally sentenced to die. For the next years, Lance fought his death sentence, filing appeal after appeal. At a recent hearing, the state quietly admitted what had been obvious for years: the entire case against Lance was built on sand. The evidence was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, and no eyewitnesses. Just a web of assumptions and contradictions stitched together by a prosecution desperate for a conviction. Every major piece of evidence in Lance's case has been challenged or contradicted by multiple witnesses. Timelines didn't match, and forensics didn't align. Yet, despite all of it, the jury convicted him, and the judge signed his death warrant. From the first day, Lance has said the same thing. He didn't kill Sergeant Carl Graham, and he has never changed that story. Decades later, he was still fighting, begging for new DNA testing on evidence that could clear his name once and for all. According to the defense, emotion took the wheel, and the investigation narrowed on one name: Lance Shockley. Out of 500 investigative leads, at least 132 pointed to other possible suspects. People with motive, with opportunity. But those trails went cold not because they lacked evidence, but because no one ever followed them. Witnesses later said police pressured them to rethink their statements until they fit the story detectives already believed. It stopped being an investigation and became a mission: to close the case, not to find the truth. When it came to his defense, Lance never stood a chance. After a jail guard claimed he overheard a confession, a story that later fell apart, Lance's public defenders walked away. He lost the only lawyers who had followed his case from the beginning. The private attorney who replaced them didn't conduct his own investigation, never challenged the state's forensics, and never brought in anyone to explain who Lance was or where he came from. So when the state's firearms analyst admitted, years later, that some of his testimony had been wrong, it was too late. The jury had already heard the worst, and they never heard a single expert argue the other side. In the end, none of it made a difference. After 16 years on death row, the court set an execution date. October 14, 2025 would be Lance's final day. That morning, Lance spent time with his daughters and a close friend, according to prison officials. When it came to his final meal, things were kept simple. He got items from the canteen: peanut butter, 3 packs of oatmeal, water, and 2 sports drinks. By 6 p.m., he was already strapped to the gurney. The witnesses were in place, the curtain drawn, and just before the drugs began to flow, he left behind a final written message. It quoted scripture: "So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you." At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Lance Colin Shockley was 48 years old. Just one day later, the next execution took place. On October 15, 2025, after spending 31 years on death row, Charles Ray Crawford was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. But what did he do? Friday, January 29, 1993, began like any other day for 20-year-old Christy Ray. She spent the afternoon working at Sunburst Bank, side by side with her mother, Mary. Christy was balancing a lot: college classes at Northeast Mississippi Community College, part-time work, and a social life in their small, quiet town of Challebeat. When the clock neared 5, the two locked up for the day, chatted for a moment in the parking lot, and went their separate ways. Mary had some errands to run, and they planned to meet later that night at home for dinner. But Mary didn't know this would be the last time she would see her daughter alive. By 6:45 p.m., Mary tried calling Christy, but there was no answer. At first, she brushed it off, thinking maybe Christy was with her boyfriend. But when she got home around 7, the silence in the house felt wrong. Christy's car was missing, the lights were off, and on the kitchen table, a single note sat waiting. The handwriting was messy, scrawled across a piece of paper with a crude map and shaky lines. It read, "There will be a red flag somewhere on this block, Tuesday, 12, midnight, $15,000 in gym bag, or she dies. No police." Mary's hands trembled as she read the words. This wasn't some prank. It was a threat, and her daughter was missing. She searched the house in a panic. Christy's purse was still there, but her bedroom looked torn apart. The phone line had been cut. And that's when the fear really took over. Mary raced through the night trying to find her. First, she drove to the home of Christy's boyfriend, then to the video store where Christy worked weekends. But no one had seen her. At the store, Mary called her husband, Tommy, and then she dialed 911. Within hours, Tippah County deputies arrived, and by midnight, the FBI was involved. Back at the house, the signs were everywhere. Someone had broken in. The screen on Christy's window had been sliced open, and a wooden pallet leaned beneath it, like it had been used to climb inside. In the master bedroom, drawers had been pulled out and rummaged through. Whoever came into that house had a plan, and they had already carried it out. Later that same day, on the other side of town, someone's family made a discovery that changed everything. In the attic of their home, tucked away like a secret, was a handwritten ransom note, chilling not just in what it said, but in how familiar it looked. They hadn't seen the letter left behind in Mary's house yet, but the handwriting was almost identical. The two women who found it didn't hesitate. It was his wife and his mother. And the person who wrote the note? Charles Crawford. Charles, better known as Chuck, was 26 years old and was already in trouble. He was supposed to go on trial that Monday for a different rape and assault case. But this was something else, something even worse. They brought the note straight to his attorney, and he wasted no time, and he got law enforcement involved that same night. By Saturday morning, the tiny town had turned into the center of a massive search. FBI agents, state troopers, and deputies from every corner of Tippah County crowded the parking lot of the local school, which now served as the command post. The disappearance of Christy wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It had become a manhunt. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Chuck. He had been out on bond, waiting for trial on another case that was supposed to be held in 4 days. But now, with this second ransom note tied directly to his family, investigators believed Christy's disappearance wasn't a coincidence, and they believed Chuck knew exactly what happened to her. Officers moved fast. They surrounded the home of Chuck's father-in-law, believing he might show up there. And he did. Just hours later, Chuck showed up carrying a double-barrel shotgun and a switchblade, and he was arrested on the spot. Inside the patrol car, he looked dazed but stayed quiet. When asked about Christy, he claimed he didn't know her personally, only by sight. But that lie didn't last long, as the FBI had questions of their own, and they weren't going to let him walk away. Chuck started off saying he had been out hunting in the woods, but when he was asked whether Christy was still alive, his facade cracked. His eyes filled with tears. "She's not alive," he whispered. And just 20 minutes later, Chuck agreed to take them to her. As night set in, he led the search team through thick brush and into the woods. Around 9:45 p.m., they reached a remote patch of forest just a few hundred yards from an old structure locals called Hopper Barn. Chuck came to a stop, pointed at the ground, and said quietly, "She's here." And when officers raked back some of the leaves, they saw her, Christie's hands were cuffed behind her back, wrapped around the trunk of a young cedar tree. A sock had been stuffed into her mouth and tied in place with a gag, and her jeans had been pulled down below her hips. Dr. Stephen Hain, the state pathologist, later said the evidence told a brutal story. Christie had still been alive when she fought. Her body was covered in scrapes and abrasions, the kind you get when you're dragged across rough ground, trying to escape. The injuries were also consistent with those of someone attempting to avoid or resist a. There were bruises on her lips, as though her face had been slammed against something hard. The marks on her wrists matched the metal cuffs that held her. And the final wound, a single deep stab to the chest, had pierced her heart and left lung. It took her 1 to 2 minutes to die, but she had felt every second of it. When the officers found her, Chuck just looked at them and said, "Why didn't you finish me off?" 2 days after his arrest, on February 1st, Chuck was ready to talk again. He said he didn't really know Christie, only that he had seen her around Walnut. He claimed he had been worried about an upcoming event, referring to his trial, and that he wanted to be alone. That's why he went to the old Hopper barn, carrying a shotgun, a revolver, and a knife, the Marine kind, as he described it. For weeks he had been stashing supplies there, cookies, soda, blankets, whatever he could find. That morning he went back there, drinking, eating cookies, and thinking about running away, or ending his life. But he wasn't able to do either, he said. By midday he wandered into the woods, built a small fire to stay warm, and claimed he blacked out. The next thing he remembered, he said, was being inside the Ray family home. When he came to, Christie was already lying on the floor, sobbing, with her hands cuffed behind her back. He told investigators that he had pulled a ski mask over his face so she couldn't recognize him, and demanded the keys to her car. But instead of leaving, he took her with him. He claimed he never meant to hurt her, just that he panicked and didn't know what else to do. And that ransom note Mary later found? He swore he didn't write it. According to him, Christie had been scared at first, but eventually calmed down as they drove. They talked, he said. For nearly an hour, they just kept driving, and by the time he parked near the old Hopper barn, things had settled down. He said he took off the ski mask, removed her handcuffs after she promised not to run, and told her they would stay the night in the barn. Chuck described it like something out of a dream, almost peaceful. He talked about sharing cookies, talking, and even leaning against each other to keep warm, but that version of events started falling apart the moment it left his mouth. By dawn, sirens cut through the stillness. Chuck heard them and panicked. He thought they were there for him. So he ran into the woods with the shotgun in one hand and the knife in the other, while Christie followed him, begging him to surrender. She told him no one was hurt, and she would help him explain everything if he just turned himself in. And for a second, Chuck almost believed her. He later said he felt low, and by his own words, Christie had almost convinced him to let her go. Almost. He said they started walking toward her car, and he even gave her the shotgun, said it was proof he didn't want to hurt her. But then, just like before, came another blackout. At least that's what he claimed. The next thing Chuck said he remembered was sitting on a tree stump deep in the woods, barefoot and dazed. Christie was at his feet, handcuffed and dead. He said she was still fully clothed, with one of his socks shoved into her mouth. He then panicked and dragged her by the feet across the ground, accidentally pulling her pants down in the process. Then he covered her with leaves and sat there for a while, staring at her body, trying to figure out what to do next. Eventually, he stood up, put his boots back on, picked up his shotgun and knife, and started walking toward his father-in-law's house. And that's where the police would arrest him later that day. Chuck admitted he had lied at first to buy time. He said he knew taking Christie was wrong. "I must have killed her," he told investigators, "but I don't remember doing it." He insisted he had blacked out, that he couldn't control himself. But when investigators searched the Hopper barn, they found the kind of supplies that only a man planning something would store: clothing, bedding, food, drinks, ammunition, even handcuff keys and a padlock. Days later, Volunteers combing through the woods near where Christie's body had been discovered found more. Under a pile of brush lay men's shoes, long johns, and a t-shirt. And not far away, a farmer uncovered a knife and a .22 revolver, and officers found a belt stamped with Chuck on the back. It matched the one Chuck had been seen wearing before the murder. Forensics linked it all together. Hairs on the barn clothing matched Christie's, and hairs found on the discarded clothes matched Chuck's own pubic hair. A mix of blood and semen on the underwear tied them both. And DNA testing made it official. His genetic profile matched the fluids found inside Christie and on the blood-stained clothing. At trial in late 1994, Chuck's defense tried to rewrite the story. His family testified about his lifelong battles with depression, violent mood swings, and blackouts. His psychiatrist described him as a man with psychogenic amnesia, someone who might act without memory, whose mind could break under pressure. He told the jury that Chuck couldn't tell right from wrong, that years of medication, psychiatric hospitalizations, and a bipolar diagnosis had left him broken. But the evidence told a different story. The blood, the DNA, the carefully hidden body, and every lie Chuck told afterward pointed not to a breakdown, but to a plan. And the state didn't back down. A psychologist from the Mississippi State Hospital took the stand and dismissed the bipolar diagnosis entirely. He said Chuck wasn't psychotic, delusional, or detached from reality. He was faking, malingering. Every action he took after the crime, from stockpiling supplies to misleading the police, suggested clear intent. A forensic psychiatrist agreed. He said Chuck didn't forget what he had done. He understood that what he did was wrong, and he then tried to cover it up. That, he said, was all the jury needed to know. Chuck hadn't lost control. He had made a choice. And it wasn't just that one case hanging over him. At the time of the murder, Chuck had already been out on bond for another violent crime, an earlier case involving rape and aggravated assault from 2 years earlier. In that case, he had also claimed insanity, saying he couldn't remember anything. But the doctors saw through it. They said he was faking, fully aware of his actions, and trying to dodge responsibility. Then, just 4 days before that earlier trial was set to begin, Chuck snapped. In court, jurors listened to hours of testimony about the ransom note, the barn, the weapons, the confession. The story was brutal, and the facts were undeniable. In 1994, they found Chuck guilty of capital murder, committed during the course of a kidnapping, and sentenced him to death. But that wasn't all. Chuck was also convicted of rape, battery, and burglary. For Christie's rape, he got life. For the burglary and battery, 30 and 15 years. And for the earlier 1993 case, another 46 years were added. Years of appeals followed, but nothing changed the outcome. The courts found no sign of insanity, no legal error, and no reason to spare his life. Then, after spending over 30 years on death row, a date was finally set. October 15, 2025. That morning, officials said Chuck seemed calm. According to a spokesperson for the Mississippi Department of Corrections, he was relaxed and ready to face today. He spent time with his family and met with a preacher he had personally chosen. For his last meal, he asked for a double cheeseburger, French fries, peach cobbler, and chocolate ice cream. When asked if he had any final words, Chuck looked toward his loved ones and said, "To my family, I love you. I'm at peace. I've got God's peace." Then he turned his attention to the victim's relatives and added, "To the victim's family, true closure and true peace. You cannot reach that without God. I'll be in heaven." The process began at 6:01 p.m. Chuck took a few deep breaths, his chest rising and falling. As required under Mississippi's protocol, officials performed a consciousness check after the first drug was administered to confirm he was fully sedated. By 6:06, he was motionless and declared unconscious. And 2 minutes after that, his breathing slowed, becoming shallow and uneven, and his mouth began to quiver. Moments later, he took one final breath before his chest appeared to stop moving entirely. At 6:15 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Charles Ray Crawford was 59 years old. 2 days later, the next execution took place. On October 17, 2025, after almost 30 years on death row, Richard Kenneth Djerf was executed by lethal injection in Arizona. But what did he do? It all began on a late summer morning in 1993, when revenge turned into one of the most brutal family murders Arizona had ever seen. Richard had met Albert Luna Jr. while mopping the floors at a Safeway in Glendale. They were both loners, but in that isolation, they quickly became friends. But neither of them could have imagined how violently it would all end. By January 1993, 23-year-old Richard was living in a small apartment when he came home one night to find it torn apart. The place had been ransacked. His television, VCR, stereo, car alarm, and even an AK-47 were all gone. He filed a report with the police, but nothing came of it. He told officers he suspected his friend Albert, but they didn't lift a finger. No follow-up, no arrest, not even a knock on a door. The silence from law enforcement dug deep under his skin, and Richard, already prone to grudges, stewed in it. He told a friend the Lunas had messed with the wrong guy. Weeks passed, but the anger didn't. It hardened, slow and stubborn, until it felt like something permanent. And by the time summer rolled around, all Richard wanted was payback. And that wish for revenge turned into action on the morning of September 14th, nearly 9 months after the break-in. Richard drove to the Luna family home carrying a 9mm Beretta, a knife, latex gloves, handcuffs, and a bouquet of fake flowers he used as a cover for what he planned to do. When Patricia, Albert's 42-year-old mother, opened the door and smiled at the small gesture, Richard shoved his way inside and immediately pointed the gun at her. He forced Patricia into the master bedroom, tied her hands, and let her 5-year-old son, Damien, wander nearby while he ransacked the house. He made Patricia pack the family car with electronics, jewelry, and even a money clip filled with food stamps. Then he taped her and Damien into chairs in the kitchen and kept asking over and over which of them should die first, and where her older son, Albert Jr., was hiding. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. It was something else entirely. Hours passed, and by 3 p.m., Patricia's 18-year-old daughter, Rochelle, came home. The front door barely had time to shut behind her before Richard grabbed her and dragged her to her bedroom. He tied her down, gagged her with tissues and tape, and her. When it was over, he stabbed her 4 times and cut her throat. The wound severed her jugular, and she died instantly. Afterward, he walked back downstairs and told Patricia exactly what he had done to her daughter. An hour later, 47-year-old Albert Luna Sr. walked through the front door, unaware of what he was walking into. As soon as the door closed behind him, Richard pulled a gun and handcuffs. He forced Albert to crawl into the bedroom, where he made him lie face down on the bed. Then he beat him with a baseball bat. The blows were loud and brutal, and so violent that blood splattered across the walls. When Albert finally stopped moving, Richard taped his wrists together and left him there. Then he went back to the kitchen and looked at Patricia, then told her that her husband was gone too. But Richard still wasn't done. And what came next was as cold as it was senseless. He grabbed Damien from behind and tried to snap his neck, like in the movies, he later told investigators. But when the boy's head turned too far and he kept breathing, Richard stopped. It hadn't worked, so he moved on to something else. He cut the cord from a kitchen lamp, stripped the wires, and taped them to Damien's leg, planning to electrocute him. When police later found the cord, it appeared to be unplugged, so whatever Richard had intended, that attempt had failed as well. Upstairs, Albert Luna Sr., who was nearly beaten to death and taped at the wrists, managed to free himself. Bleeding and dazed, he stumbled into the kitchen clutching a pocket knife. With what energy he had left, he lunged at Richard and slashed him deep across his arm and torso. Caught off guard, Richard pulled his Beretta and opened fire. 6 shots rang out, and Albert collapsed in front of his wife and son, dead. Then Richard turned to Patricia. "Do you want to watch your kid die, or do you want your kid to watch you die?" he asked. But before she could answer, he shot them both in the head. And he wasn't finished. After that, Richard drenched the bodies, the walls, and the floor in gasoline. He lit a red fuse cord and watched it burn for a moment. But something stopped him. He later told his girlfriend he saw the neighborhood kids outside. He didn't want to be seen. So he stomped out the flame, turned on the stove's burners, placed a pizza box and a rag on top, and walked out the front door. But the fire never caught. He drove away in the family's car, bleeding, shaken, and trying to play it cool. And when his girlfriend asked about the cuts on his body, he said he had been stabbed and robbed. But she knew better. Something was off. Later that night, the Luna's oldest son, 21-year-old Albert Jr., came home around 11:45 p.m. He had been worried. No one had answered the phone all evening. Inside the house, he found a scene no one would ever forget. His family was gone. He ran out of the house straight to his girlfriend's place and called the police. By September 16th, Richard had been released from the hospital where doctors treated the knife wounds Albert Sr. had given him during the struggle. But instead of going home, Richard checked into a motel and kept a low profile. Still, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. He called friends, talked to his girlfriend, and told bits and pieces of what happened, each version darker than the one before. Just 2 days later, on September 18th, the case took a turn. Word had gotten to the police, and they had heard enough. They tracked Richard down, arrested him, and began the search. What they found in his apartment and car left no doubt. They found several items belonging to the Luna family, along with the weapons used in the killings. But Richard wasn't planning to stay behind bars for long. While awaiting trial in jail, he tried to end his own life. He had hidden a sharp piece of metal inside a Halloween card and used it on his wrists. But he survived. By 1995, the case had finally made it to court, and it came with a mountain of charges. The Maricopa County grand jury indicted Richard on 18 counts. 4 were for first-degree murder in the deaths of Albert Sr., Patricia, Rochelle, and little Damian Luna. The rest covered burglary, kidnapping, sexual assault, aggravated assault, arson, theft, and weapons misconduct. From the beginning, it was clear the state wanted the death penalty. Richard had been assigned 2 defense attorneys, but he didn't want them. He stood in front of the judge and made it clear he would represent himself. On February 15, 1995, he filed a motion to fire both lawyers and take full control of the case. That meant managing his own defense in a capital trial where his life was on the line. But prosecutors weren't ready to let that slide. They argued that a man who had recently tried to end his own life in jail might not be capable of representing himself. The judge ordered a mental competency evaluation. Psychiatrist Dr. Jack Potts met with Richard and later took the stand. According to Dr. Potts, Richard wasn't out of touch with reality. He wasn't irrational or disoriented. In fact, he described him as cold, calculated, and completely in control. He was found fully competent, and based on that report, the judge ruled that Richard had the right to represent himself. Soon after, Richard made his next move. He didn't fight the charges. In March 1995, he pleaded guilty to all 4 murders. But the plea didn't spare him the death penalty. It only meant the state dropped the lesser counts. He knew full well the state could still ask for execution, and at the time, he accepted that. But that didn't last. Within weeks, Richard changed his mind again. He dropped his attempt at representing himself and brought his lawyers back. The case moved into a tense round of presentence hearings where both sides laid everything out, every detail of what made the crimes worse, and every reason the defense believed he deserved mercy. But the judge wasn't moved. He found that Richard had acted out of pure greed, that the killings were especially cruel and depraved, and that one of the victims was under 15. The defense tried to argue for mercy, pointing to Richard's rough childhood, his mental health struggles, and his claimed remorse, but the court wasn't buying it. Records also showed a pattern of violence long before the arrests. Before the September arrest, Richard had already been arrested 3 times, once for shoplifting and twice for extortion at Independence High School, which he attended until 1988. School paperwork even recorded a threat he made on November 16, 1988, when he told a student to pay him $35, or else I'll take you to the desert, beat your face in, and bury you. In 1995, Richard agreed to plead guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. Maybe he thought it would save him. Maybe his attorneys told him it was the only shot at avoiding a death sentence. But it didn't work. On May 22, 1996, the judge sentenced him to die, not once, but 4 times. Richard didn't flinch. He just smirked and said, "They can only kill me once." But later, away from the cameras, he admitted the arrest had crushed him. "I started crying," he said quietly. He claimed that everything had started over a stolen gun and $2,600 worth of electronics. According to Richard, Albert had broken into his apartment after being released from jail for other burglaries. "When Albert got out, he wanted some stuff I had," Richard said. "I told the police, but they didn't do much. Then I called his mom, and she said she didn't believe it. The whole thing made me pretty upset." For years after, Richard filed appeals in Arizona's courts, and when those failed, he turned to the federal courts. But each time the answer came back the same. He would spend the next decades lying on the thin mattress of his prison cell, trying not to think about the murders or the sentence hanging over him. "I listen to songs on the radio and write down the words," he once said with a soft laugh. "I've got about 25 done." Then he paused, the weight of it all sinking in. "I can't imagine being in a place like this the rest of my life," he whispered. "I want to get out of here." And eventually he did, but not in the way he hoped. In 2019, the Ninth Circuit upheld both his conviction and his death sentence, closing the door on any more appeals. Then, in May 2025, nearly 29 years to the day after he was first sentenced, the Arizona Supreme Court signed his death warrant. And this time, Richard didn't fight it. A month before his execution, he wrote a letter to reporters. In it, he apologized for the murders and said he wouldn't ask for clemency. He wrote, "I have some brain dysfunction that likely contributed to the horrible crimes that I committed. But that can never excuse the harm I caused." His final day came at October 17, 2025. At 5:30 p.m. the evening before his execution, he got his final meal. For that, Richard requested a double cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato, deep-fried onion rings with ketchup, and a slice of cherry pie topped with whipped cream, all from a local restaurant. The next morning at 10:01 a.m., he was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses were already in place. Richard wore all white with black flip-flops. The curtain opened at 10:07. He lay down calmly on the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he said, "I do not." When someone asked if he was okay, he nodded and said yes. But placing the IV lines proved difficult. Medical staff had to insert and remove them multiple times, up to 4 times. The right arm alone took nearly 5 minutes, and it wasn't until 9 minutes in that both lines were finally secure. Arizona's execution process has faced heavy scrutiny in recent years, especially over its repeated failures to properly set IV lines. But in Richard's case, officials said his weight made it more difficult than usual. Still, once the lines were finally set, the rest of the process moved forward without delay. At 10:24 a.m., the first dose was administered. Within 2 minutes, Richard took several heavy breaths, his mouth slightly open, and after 6 minutes, his chest stopped moving. At 10:32, a staff member entered to check for any signs of life. Richard's eyes were closed. He lay completely still, without a pulse. He was pronounced dead at 10:40 a.m. Richard Kenneth Djerf was 55 years old. A week later, the next execution took place. On October 23, 2025, after spending more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Todd Boyd was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. But what did he do? It all started with a phone call on a sweltering Saturday, July 31, 1993, a day that would end in one of the most brutal murders Talladega County had ever seen. That afternoon, Anthony reached out to a friend, 22-year-old Dwinon Quinte Cox, and claimed he had been robbed. He said he knew who did it, and now he needed help finding the guy. When Quinty pulled up to the Glen Addy apartments, Anthony was already there, agitated and pacing. He said the man who stole from him was Dexter Spinks, and that all he needed was a gun and someone to ride with him. Quinty left and came back with a Mac 11, a compact, rapid-fire pistol designed for intimidation more than precision. And with that, the hunt began. Robert Sean Ingram joined them, and the three piled into his car. They started driving, block after block, circling neighborhoods for over half an hour, searching for Dexter. But they couldn't find him. Not yet. While driving, they crossed paths with Monique Marcel Ackles, who was behind the wheel of a blue Chevy Astro van. Marcel joined in, and they moved everyone over into the van. They kept driving, still looking for Dexter, but came up empty again. Then, as they rolled down 15th Street, something else caught their eye. Near a patch of trees by the area folks called Happy Tree stood Gregory Hughley, known to most as New York. A few days earlier, he had taken drugs from Anthony, but he never paid up. He owed him $200, and now that Anthony was all riled up and couldn't find Dexter, that was all it took. Here stood Gregory, and without hesitation, Sean grabbed the gun, jumped out of the van, and shouted at him. Gregory froze. He already knew why they were there, and he raised his hands. "Please don't kill me," he begged. "Just beat me." But Sean wasn't listening. He just grabbed Gregory by the shirt, shoved him into the van, slammed the door, and they took off. Inside, Gregory lay on the floor, still begging. "Don't kill me. I'll get your money." But mercy wasn't on the agenda that day. They made a quick stop to fill a plastic container with gasoline, and then they headed to Hall Grove Ballpark. Sean still held the gun when they yanked Gregory from the van and forced him onto a wooden bench. Marcel taped his hands and mouth while Anthony secured his feet, and once bound, Gregory was face down on the bench and helpless. He was begging for his life, but everyone ignored him. Then Sean splashed gasoline over Gregory and poured a short trail leading away from the bench. Then he lit a match. The fire jumped instantly, racing up the line and igniting Gregory's clothes. Gregory screamed and twisted, but the others didn't help. They just stood there, watching. For 10, maybe 15 minutes, no one moved, not until Gregory rolled off the bench and stopped moving. When it was over, they all climbed back into the van. As they drove back toward Anniston, the night closing in around them, Anthony broke the silence. He looked out the window and said, "Well, we're all in this together now. If one goes down, we all go down." It was already dark when Quinty dropped him off at the Glen Addy apartments around 8 p.m. He drove home alone after that, trying not to think about what he had just seen. But there was no escaping it. The image of Gregory's body, lit up like a bonfire in a quiet field, was burned into his memory for good. The next morning, on August 1st, Jesse Smith headed out to the Hall Grove Ballpark in Talladega County with a few friends. It was a quiet patch of open land surrounded by trees, a place where families came on weekends and kids played ball. But that day, before he saw anything, he smelled it. Smoke mixed with something sour, something wrong. Then he found it. Near the benches, under the summer sun, lay what was left of a human body, burned, twisted, and blackened against the dirt. Jesse didn't hesitate. He ran to the nearest phone and called the Talladega County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived fast, sealing off the field with yellow tape. They photographed everything, the burned ground, the melted wood, and the trail of ash that told its own story. But the evidence was thin. Investigators found 2 fingerprints at the scene, but when the lab reports came back, they matched a local investigator who had handled the materials himself. Still, by then, the story had already started spreading through town. At first, it was just whispers, but whispers turned into talk, and talk turned into tips. And it didn't take long before names surfaced: Anthony Boyd, Robert Sean Ingram, Monique Marcel Ackles, and Dwinon Quinte Cox. And the motive that emerged was cruel and pointless. And once they were in handcuffs, It didn't take much for them to start pointing fingers. But the physical evidence told its own story. According to the state medical examiner, Gregory's tongue, throat, and epiglottis were burned and swollen, and there was soot inside his trachea. That meant Gregory had been alive when the fire started, breathing in smoke as his body burned. And the tape marks were still visible on his right arm and across his mouth. The cause of death had been determined as thermal burns. Toxicology tests added another layer. They revealed traces of alcohol, cocaine, and cocaethylene, a chemical formed when both are used together. It meant Gregory had been under the influence when he died, likely confused, maybe even unaware just how fast everything was unraveling. But in the courtroom, the story was brutal and unmistakable. The evidence laid bare a man who had begged for his life, tied down, silenced, and burned alive, then dumped in a public park like garbage, left for strangers to find. The trial, held in Talladega County, Alabama, began in 1995, almost 2 years after Gregory's murder. And from the start, it drew attention across the state, not just because of how brutal it was, but because of how carefully prosecutors said the whole thing had been planned by Anthony and his co-defendants. Anthony was charged with capital murder, an intentional killing committed during a first-degree kidnapping. He didn't know what hit him. "I didn't even know Alabama had the death penalty," he later said. "When they told me it was capital murder, I said, 'What is that?' All in capital letters." But prosecutors weren't laughing. They told the court this wasn't some out-of-control moment or random violence. This crime was deliberate, organized, and meant to send a message. The motive, they said, was simple. Gregory had taken about $200 worth of cocaine from Anthony without paying for it, and for them, that was reason enough to kill him. They said Anthony helped restrain Gregory and didn't just go along with it. He was in it from the start. One witness remembered Anthony saying, "We're all in this together now." The defense had little to work with. They mentioned Anthony's age, he was just 24 at the time, and brought up his troubled past. But those arguments carried little weight. His attorneys tried to minimize his role, saying he wasn't the one who lit the fire or made the plan. But the state pushed back hard, arguing that he was just as responsible as anyone else who took part. Later, they tried to take it back. During appeals, Anthony's lawyers claimed he was at a party the night of the murder, and Anthony never changed his story. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in any killing," he said. But by then, the damage was done, and the jury had already made up its mind. After several days of testimony, they returned a guilty verdict. Prosecutors had argued that the murder took place during a kidnapping, which under Alabama law automatically qualified the crime for the death penalty. And that single detail sealed his fate. On August 5, 1995, the jury recommended the death penalty. Just a few days later, the judge agreed and formally sentenced Anthony Todd Boyd to die in the electric chair, a sentence that would later be converted to nitrogen hypoxia under Alabama's updated law. Sean got the death penalty too. Out of everyone involved, he was the one everyone feared most, the one who came up with the plan and set everything in motion. It was Sean who held the gun, grabbed Gregory off the street, and shoved him into that van. And when they got to the ballpark, he was the one who poured the gasoline and lit the match. Prosecutors called him the leader, the executioner, and the jury agreed. Sean never denied what happened. He just said Gregory deserved it. Now, more than 30 years later, he is still on death row at Holman Correctional Facility, waiting for the same fate Anthony met. Marcel's fate looked different. He wasn't the one who lit the fire, but he was behind the wheel of the blue Astro van. He helped tape Gregory down and stood by as the flames consumed the bench. The law still held him accountable, but saw his role as less direct. Marcel took a plea deal, avoiding the death penalty by agreeing to testify. In exchange, he received life in prison without parole, where he remains to this day. Quinte played the smallest role, but he still had blood on his conscience. He supplied the gun and followed the van in his own car, trailing behind as Gregory was taken toward the park. He claimed he didn't know how far it would go, but by the time he realized, it was already over. In court, Quinty became a state witness. He described the kidnapping step by step and repeated what Anthony had said on the drive back to Anniston. "We're all in this together now." That testimony spared him from a harsher sentence. He was given life with the possibility of parole, a punishment that kept him locked away but didn't take away hope. Since then, he has been released in 2009. Anthony, though, never got that chance. His death sentence remained intact through decades of appeals. The Alabama Supreme Court and later the federal courts reviewed claims of ineffective legal defense and misconduct from prosecutors, but each time they upheld the conviction and the sentence. Still, Anthony kept saying he was innocent. He insisted he had nothing to do with Gregory's death. "It's easy to paint a picture when you got the paintbrush in your hands," he said. "They painted the picture they wanted to paint." And while his family still visits him at Holman, prison life has stripped away much of what he once had. His kids are grown now. His grandchildren were born while he sat behind bars. His father died, and so did his grandmother and great-grandmother. Time didn't stop for them just because he was locked away. And now, after all those years, the state has chosen a date. His execution is set on his daughter's birthday, October 23, 2025. His execution would be carried out using nitrogen gas, a method Alabama had only recently started using. The process involves strapping a mask tightly over his face and pumping in pure nitrogen, cutting off the oxygen he needed to survive. Anthony had asked to be executed by firing squad instead, but the courts denied that request. On his final day, he spent time with two of his daughters, his mother, his brother, 3 friends, a son-in-law, and his spiritual advisor. He also made phone calls to a brother and a close friend. Throughout the day, he was seen eating a mix of snacks, a cheeseburger, barbecue Fritos popcorn, a Reese's cup, Skittles, Starburst, and a cheeseburger. He drank a strawberry Sun-Kissed, Dole lemonade, orange V8 splash, water, and coffee. He ate breakfast and lunch but turned down his dinner. He also didn't request a final meal. Later that evening, corrections officers led him into the execution chamber. The curtain to the witness room opened at 5:50 p.m. Anthony looked out and smiled toward the 4 witnesses present, his brother and 3 members of the media. He gave a thumbs up and flashed a hand sign. When asked if he had any final words, he used the moment to declare his innocence and call out the justice system. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody," he said. He criticized the courts, saying they weren't fair. "There's no justice in this state. It's all political. It's revenge motivated." Anthony said, "It's not about closure because closure comes from within, not an execution." He ended his final statement, "Keep fighting. I love every single one of y'all." And his final words before the mask sealed shut were, "Let's get it." Then the gas began to flow. At about 5:57 p.m., Anthony's body started to react. He clenched his fist and raised his head slightly off the gurney, then his legs rose several inches. A few minutes later, he began taking deep, labored breaths, long, uneven gasps that went on for at least 15 minutes. Then, finally, he stopped moving. At 6:27 p.m., the curtain to the chamber closed. The prison's commissioner later explained that the nitrogen gas continued for 5 full minutes after the heart stops, just to be sure. He was pronounced dead at 6:33 p.m. Anthony Todd Boyd was 56 years old. The last execution of the month took place on October 28, 2025. After spending almost 25 years on death row, Norman Mearle Grimm was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? Around 3:30 in the afternoon on July 27, 1998, James Andrews was fishing off the Pensacola Bay Bridge with his young son when he felt something catch on his line. He tugged and pulled it in. But what broke the surface wasn't a fish. It was a body, wrapped tight in sheets, plastic, and masking tape. Authorities pulled the bundle from the water and later identified the body as Cynthia Campbell. But how did she end up in the river, wrapped in plastic? Just that morning, a few hours before the discovery, a call came in to dispatch about a disturbance behind a house in a quiet Pensacola neighborhood. Deputy Timothy Lynch responded around 5 a.m. When he arrived, he found Cynthia already waiting on her front porch, barefoot, wrapped in a nightgown and robe. Standing beside her was her 38-year-old neighbor, Norman Grimm, shirtless and barefoot himself, wearing only cut-off jeans. The scene felt strange but not dangerous, and at first there didn't seem to be any clear threat. The three of them walked toward the back of Cynthia's house, and under the porch light, Tim noticed a broken window. Glass shards glittered in the grass, and in the flower bed, a chrome lug nut caught the morning light. It looked minor, just a small act of vandalism at worst, but something about it didn't feel right. Before leaving, the deputy wrapped up his paperwork, and Norman turned to Cynthia with a calm smile. He said she could come over for coffee once the deputy was gone, but nobody knew this would be the last time anyone saw her alive. By 7:20 that morning, Cynthia's bookkeeper, Connie Kelly, pulled into the driveway, and right away she sensed something was off. The front door was unlocked, but Cynthia didn't answer when she called her name. Connie walked through the kitchen, expecting to find her boss running late, but the house was silent. Cynthia, who was a lawyer, rarely late and never missed a meeting, was nowhere to be found. So Connie stepped back outside and immediately called the police. Within the next hour, more people showed up. Cynthia McGee, her paralegal, pulled up next. She saw Cynthia's car still parked outside, with her purse sitting in plain view on the seat. But just like Connie, she couldn't find her anywhere. At that same moment, two deputies, Calvin Rutherford and Stephen McCauley, pulled up and started knocking on doors. When they reached Norman's house, he came to the door shirtless again. The deputies spotted a faint stain on his shoulder that looked like blood and asked him about it. But Norman told them it was primer paint from working on his car, and inside his house, nothing looked out of place. He acted casual, friendly even. So the deputies left without much concern. By 11 a.m., Corporal Blevin Davis joined the search. He, too, spoke with Norman and noticed the same shoulder stain, but he saw more. Norman's cut-off jeans seemed speckled with small reddish-brown stains, and there was one more mark on his shoulder, which was darker than the rest. But Norman gave the same explanation he gave the other officers. It was paint. Davis made a note of it, but didn't push further. And since Cynthia's house showed no signs of a break-in or struggle either, officers logged the visit and moved on, assuming she had simply gone out for the day. But what none of them realized was that her body was already there, hidden, and they had walked right past it. Norman had already wrapped Cynthia's body in bed sheets, a shower curtain, masking tape, and black garbage bags, and had stashed it in the trunk of his car. The officers had asked him if he could open it, but he told them he didn't have the keys. And around 1 p.m. he left the neighborhood and headed straight for the Pensacola Bay Bridge, which stretched for miles across the Gulf, connecting the city to the open water. If he dumped her there, he figured, the current would do the rest. Somewhere along the bridge, Norman pulled over. He parked on the shoulder, opened both car doors, and popped the trunk. Drivers passing by saw him pacing beside the car, wearing a light-colored shirt and those same cut-off jeans he had been wearing earlier that morning. From a distance, it looked like he had car trouble, but the truth sat heavy in the back, silent, wrapped, and lifeless. Norman waited, and when the road was clear, he reached into the trunk and pulled Cynthia's body out. He carried it to the edge of the bridge and without hesitation lifted it over the rail. Then he let go. The bundle dropped into the water and began to sink until there was nothing left to see. Norman climbed back into his car and drove away, leaving the bridge as if nothing had happened. On the way home, he stopped at a small bait and tackle shop near the base of the bridge. The man behind the counter remembered how odd he looked. Norman acted all restless and distracted, and he was all sweaty. He bought something small, something forgettable, and walked back out to his car. But Cynthia's body didn't stay hidden for long. Just over an hour later, around 3:30 p.m., a fisherman and his young son were fishing beneath that same bridge when their hook caught something heavy. It was Cynthia. And when the call came in that a woman's body had been pulled from the bay, detectives knew they weren't chasing a missing person anymore. This was a homicide. Detective Donnie Wiggin headed straight to the bait shop near the base of the Pensacola Bay Bridge. He asked questions, pulled the surveillance tape, and rolled it back to the early afternoon. There, on the screen, was Norman, walking through the door at exactly 2:03 p.m. He was wearing the same cut-off jeans and the same light shirt. But it wasn't just what he was wearing. It was how he moved. He looked jittery, off, and now unmistakably connected. At the same time that footage was playing back, officers stood at the water's edge, peeling away the soaked sheets from Cynthia's body. Tangled in the fabric were strips of green carpet. And one detective didn't even need a sample bag. He recognized it immediately. There was a nearly identical piece hanging over the railing of Norman's back porch that morning. And when they reached the body, Cynthia was still wearing her nightshirt. With that, everything started to connect. The broken window, the stains on Norman's shorts, the nightgown Cynthia was wearing, and the carpet. By nightfall, detectives had enough. A search warrant was signed for Norman's home, and an arrest warrant for murder followed. Every movement he had made that day, from the broken window behind her house to the bridge where he dumped her body, had come full circle. By 6 p.m., his house was sealed off as a crime scene, but Norman was already gone. Inside, investigators found the kind of details that sealed the case. From the back porch, a faint smell of bleach still hung in the air. They found 2 damp mops nearby, both stained with what looked like blood. Smears trailed across the kitchen floor, and on the counter they found a coffee cup with Cynthia's fingerprints. Next to it lay a box of trash bags. One side was streaked with blood and marked with Norman's prints. In the trash can, they found a striped pillowcase that matched the sheets used to wrap Cynthia's body. And in the living room, detectives collected a pair of athletic shoes, blue shorts, and a piece of rope, all spotted with blood. And on the back porch, they found the carpet, the same green fabric as the one Cynthia had been wrapped in. But the search didn't stop there. In a cooler, detectives found a hammer with dried blood, a steak knife, a pair of women's glasses, a tampon, underwear, masking tape, and a Bud Light carton. And the lab results left no room for doubt. Cynthia's DNA was found everywhere. On Norman's shorts, on his shoes, on the hammer, and on the knife in the cooler. His fingerprints were on the tape, and her blood was on his kitchen floor. Even the bedsheets wrapped around her body came from his own bed. And the autopsy confirmed the horror. The forensic pathologist listed that Cynthia had been stabbed 11 times in the chest, of which 7 pierced her heart. Her face and scalp were covered in deep bruises, injuries consistent with repeated strikes from a hammer. The pathologist said the blows to her head came first, followed by the stab wounds. And the official cause of death was blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds. She had been raped, beaten, stabbed, wrapped in bedsheets, and dumped into the bay. And Norman was the one responsible for it. But where was he? In the days that followed, Norman made it all the way to Oklahoma, but by July 31, 1998, just 3 days after the murder, U.S. Marshals had him in handcuffs. And back in Florida, the evidence against him was overwhelming. During trial, prosecutors walked the jury through the timeline minute by minute. They showed the jury the surveillance footage of Norman at the bait shop just an hour before Cynthia's body had been found. They laid out the forensic reports, DNA results, and expert testimony, and all of it tied him to the crime scene. When it was over, the jury didn't need long to decide. Norman was found guilty of first-degree murder and battery with the use of a deadly weapon. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors brought up Norman's past, robberies, kidnappings, and violent assaults that stretched back for years. Each conviction showed the same pattern. His violence wasn't slowing down. It was getting worse over time. Then came Dorothea Campbell, Cynthia's mother. She stood before the jury, her hands trembling, and read a short statement about her daughter's life and the hole left behind. When it was over, the jury's vote was unanimous, 12-0 for death. But after the verdict, Norman refused to fight for his life. He just sat there, motionless, and told his lawyers not to call a single witness, not to show a single photograph, and not to argue for mercy, even as the court appointed special counsel to investigate anything that might lessen his sentence, his childhood, his mental health, or his years in prison. Norman refused to participate. Against his lawyer's advice, he demanded silence. He even told the judge outright he didn't want mercy. He wanted to die. Still, the court considered what little it could. Norman started drinking at 13, and at 19 he enlisted in the Navy, trying to prove himself in the only way he knew how. But the stress of military life did not help his addiction. Records showed a chaotic upbringing, childhood abuse, and signs of mental instability that never received real treatment. But the aggravating factors outweighed them all. He was already under a sentence when the murder happened. He had prior violent felonies, and he killed Cynthia during a sexual assault. In December 2000, the judge officially handed down the sentence: death for murder, plus a total of 390 months for sexual battery, to be served consecutively as if time still mattered. Norman spent almost 25 years on death row, and now in his 60s, he still refuses to answer questions. He has never expressed remorse, never filed a clemency plea, and never explained why he did it. Then his final day came, October 28, 2025. On the morning of his execution, Norman woke up around 6 a.m. According to the Department of Corrections, he didn't ask to see a spiritual advisor, and no visitors came to see him in the hours before his death. As the day wore on, he remained alone. Later that afternoon, he was served his final meal: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, a chocolate milkshake, and a slice of pie. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Norman lay strapped to the gurney, one arm stretched out with an IV already in place. When asked if he wanted to give a final statement, he kept his voice low and flat. "No, sir." Roughly a minute later, the injection began. Norman closed his eyes and drew in a few heavy breaths. His body twitched slightly, then stopped moving altogether. The warden stepped forward, shook him a few times, and called his name, but he didn't respond. At 6:13 p.m., a medic entered to check his vitals, and 1 minute later, Norman was declared dead. Norman Mearle Grimm was 65 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in October 2025. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.